Welcome to the first background lesson in AP Psychology. Over the course of the coming year, we'll survey the main topics and domains of psychology so as to provide you an overview of this discipline. One goal of our course is to ensure that you all gain a better understanding of the connection between your body and your mind, and that you are able to marvel at all that the brain can do, and at the same time, that you're able to understand that our knowledge of all that the brain does is very incomplete. Well, perhaps a good place to start is with psychology's history. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded the first known psychological experiment. It went something like this. In the 7th century BCE, Pharaoh Samticks I of Egypt wanted to prove the long-held belief that Egyptians, who he thought were the most advanced of all peoples, were the most ancient race on earth. He posed a simple hypothesis, an if-then statement, that if a child had no opportunity to learn a language from those around them, then that child would spontaneously speak the primal inborn language of all humankind, i.e., the natural language of its most ancient people, which Samticks believed would be the Egyptian language. In other words, Samticks thought that a child who remained unexposed to language, either formally or informally, would nonetheless speak a language at some point, and he believed that the language they'd speak would be Egyptian. Well, to test his hypothesis, Samticks acquired, perhaps kidnapped would be a better word, a set of twins from a lower-class mother, and he ordered a shepherd to a remote area to raise them away from all civilization. The children were to be properly fed and cared for, but they were never to hear a spoken word. So, the shepherd and his wife took the children with them out into the wilderness, and they committed to staying away from society and to not speaking in front of the children until they heard the children speak. Well, the experiment worked, but it didn't quite yield the result Samticks expected. The herdsman brought the children back to the city and reported to Samticks that the children, who were now about 2 years old, had run up to him as he returned to his cottage from work, and they cried out, "Bekos!" Well, the herdsman had no idea what this word meant, but as the children had repeated the word several times, he was in turn able to report this occurrence to the Pharaoh. Well, Samticks called the children before him and heard them say the word. Apparently, that was their only known word. Samticks then called his advisors together and asked them about this word, this bekos. What did it mean? Was it an ancient form of Egyptian? Well, Samticks' advisors informed him that the word bekos was a Phrygian word. Phrygian is an early form of Turkish, and they believed that the word bekos meant bread. Well, Samticks was disappointed, but he had to concede that his hypothesis was wrong, and he acknowledged that the Phrygians must be an older race than the Egyptians. But we have to ask ourselves, was that a good experiment? Does this 2-year process that Samticks put the children under actually constitute good experimentation? So take a little time and think to yourself, are there weaknesses in the Pharaoh's hypothesis? What were the strengths and weaknesses of his experiment? What were the strengths and weaknesses of his conclusions? It would be nearly 3 centuries after Pharaoh Samticks' time before modern psychology developed as a scientific endeavor. The first modern psychological experiment was conducted by Professor Wilhelm Wundt and his students at his psychology laboratory, the first laboratory of its kind anywhere, at the University of Leipzig in 1879. These men were collecting data on the duration of apperception, the time lag between a subject hearing a noise and that subject indicating their perception of that noise. The men together built an apparatus that included a chronoscope. Chronoscope had a hanging weight and 2 dials. They could measure time this way. It had a sounder. The sounder had a metal stand and a raised arm from which a ball would drop onto the platform, and a telegrapher's key. When each subject had determined that they'd heard the ball hit the platform, they were to press the telegraph key, and the men could then measure the time between when the ball hit the platform and when the key was pressed. The study of apperception fit into the definition of psychology at the time. These earliest modern psychologists believed that the subject matter of psychology was the documentation of immediate experience. One of Wundt's students, the American Edward Titchener, would bring some of those ideas to Cornell University in the 1890s, where he founded one of psychology's first schools of thought, Structuralism, the study of the elements of consciousness. Titchener's goals were to analyze conscious processes into their basic elements, which he categorized as sensations, images, and feelings. What he wanted to do was to discover how these elements became connected and to specify the laws of connection between these elements. Wundt and Titchener believed that each subject's self-observation or introspection was the primary method by which psychologists could obtain data from their experiments. An important aspect of introspection was that an observer, the subject, had to describe a conscious experience in its most basic terms. For example, a subject couldn't describe eating an apple and say it tasted like an apple. They had to say that it was a cold feeling, that the apple was crisp or that it was sweet, that it was hard to break through the skin or easy. They had to really break things down to the smallest, minute pieces. Well, by the time Titchener was developing structuralism at Cornell, a competing school of psychology, Functionalism, had been founded at Harvard University by Dr. William James. Dr. James believed that psychology should study the mind as it functions in helping an organism adapt to its environment. Now, given that focus, it's obvious that functionalists were heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's concept of natural selection. Darwin had proposed a theory about how an organism's anatomical structures adapt to their environment. Functionalists wanted to understand how people's minds adapted to their environments, both natural environments and human-made ones. And they figured they could do this by studying behaviors. For these psychologists, function referred both to understanding how various mental processes operated, as well as understanding why a specific mental process might be passed on to later generations through natural selection. Functionalists were thus interested in studying people and animals in all sorts of environments. For example, some functionalists were interested in how athletes adapted to their sporting environments. Most people run away from a projectile coming at them at extreme velocity. How then did a baseball player's natural reflexes adapt to the fact that they're trying to catch this projectile instead? In the early 20th century, a third school of psychology, Gestalt, was founded by Max Wertheimer as a revolution against structuralism. The German word Gestalt translates roughly to essence or shape of an entity's complete form. A Gestalt psychologist defines psychology as the study of the immediate experience of the whole organism. They argue, unlike structuralism, that understanding the whole is actually different from understanding the sum of its parts. Well, Wertheimer developed an explanation for apparent movement, when a person sees movement in an object that doesn't actually move. Hopefully you're experiencing this as you look at the screen. Structuralists had identified this phenomenon, but they couldn't or wouldn't explain it. So Wertheimer became curious. Many modern researchers trace contemporary interest in cognitive psychology to the Gestalt movement. This movement has been an important aspect of graphic design. Gestalt theory helps graphic designers understand how the public might view an image or set of images before it goes out in an ad, for example. Another school of psychology, which developed at the turn of the 20th century, is probably the most famous school, Psychoanalysis. Developed by Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis focuses on the origin, development, and treatment of what Freud called abnormal behavior, what today we refer to as the domain of clinical psychology. Freud concluded that unconscious mental forces direct our everyday behavior, and that psychological maladjustment resulted from unresolved conflicts of which a person was completely unaware. He pioneered the use of various techniques, like dream analysis, to explore these unconscious forces in the hope of enabling patients to lead more rational and stable lives. Freud famously analyzed his patients' thoughts and dreams by asking them questions as they visited his office and reclined on his couch. And in this image, you can see that famous couch and office. Despite Freud's great hold on popular culture, he didn't found what is widely considered the most influential school of psychology. Behaviorism was founded in the 20th century by John Watson, who trained as a functionalist. Watson argued that psychology should study only what could be observed and measured objectively. Introspection should cease to be a tool for gathering data altogether. Psychology was thus redefined in the middle of the 20th century as the scientific study of observable behavior. Behaviorists focused on how behaviors are learned and modified, so much of their influence has come through their theories of learning and their ideas for treating various disorders. The large grainy image you see here is from John Watson's famous case study on little Albert. We'll definitely be taking a look at that experiment later on in the course. Today, psychology is defined as the science of behavior and mental processes. Because it's a study of behavior, it's often characterized as a social science. Because it's a study of mental processes, which obviously includes neuroscience as well as various medical sciences, it's also characterized as a science. So as we continue with our study of psychology, you'll see the interplay of these concepts, behavior and mental processes, and how understanding both in various contexts help us understand both humans and animals just a little bit better.